All right, good morning and welcome to IB History of the Americas. Hopefully you had a good start to your day. And so let's just proceed here with the study of the Great Depression. It would be fantastic if you could put into the prompt or put into the chat a response to the prompt, one word or phrase that describes the United States economy during the 1920s. I mean, that'd be fantastic if you could do that. Seems kind of coincidental as we're studying the causes of the Great Depression. I was watching on National Geographic a little documentary of the 1980s, and they highlighted the crash of 1987. So it seems coincidental. And then looking at the news with as President-elect Biden is fleshing out his administration, he has tapped as his Secretary of Treasury, Miss Yellen, who happened to be the Fed chairman during the Great Recession. So lot of connections and coincidences going on in the news and on television, connecting with what we're kind of studying right now as well. All right, so see that as I'm looking at the chat, fantastic responses. And yeah, you know, it looks like the 1920s was a booming time. We did call it the Roaring 20s. And I can't remember if in 11th grade, if you're reading The Great Gatsby or you do that in 12th grade. I know sometimes it switches back and forth, but The Great Gatsby kind of is highlighting the roaringness of the 1920s. When I think of my grandparents, or at least on my mom's side, they kind of reminded me of the 1920s with the roar with it. Especially my grandfather, in terms of how he would nostalgically talk about the 1920s. Okay, so as we can see, kind of like our agenda today, putting in a word or a thought, that'd be fantastic. I'm going to try ways to get you to become more interactive with class. If it could mean just putting it in the chat, or if it means calling on you, or finding some type of application to get you to become a little bit more active. All that stuff helps out in this process of learning, at least distant learning, and then as well as when we do hopefully get back into the classroom, this can continue with that as well. Okay, so with that, I have a video clip here, and it's from a documentary called Stormy Weather, which seems to be appropriate as we go through the 1930s here. Weather related, what environment, perhaps maybe someone can verbalize or put in the chat, what environmental catastrophe was happening in the United States during the 1920s that could indicate stormy weather? So what environmental catastrophe could be happening here in the 1930s? Impacted Minnesota a little bit in the southwestern corner of our state. Yes, it was the dust storm. I think we'll call it the dust bowl. But yes, that is what happened. And it seemed like, you know, for the farmers, the 1920s wasn't kind. In the 1930s, it was equally difficult for them because of the environment. Seems like the fertile soil just simply vanished. And so that was very unfortunate. And it had a combination of Mother Nature, but then also farming practices as well. Okay, so I got a little video clip here, and the video clip is going to bring in maybe some of the immediate impacts of the collapse of the financial market, and again, how it had a kind of an immediate ripple effect here. And so what, again, I like you to do is think about, some takeaways or thoughts about what you've seen with this little clip here. Okay, so any takeaways or thoughts about what you are viewing? Okay, so let me get this started.
Without warning. After a decade of expanding prosperity, almost overnight, the Wall Street crash of 1929 shattered America's confidence in its economy.
I was 11 years old. How well I remember. It was like the skies had grown dark. Thunder. And all of a sudden, faces were tragic. And people were walking around in the hallways of our building and in the streets with inquiring eyes and saying, has it happened to you? Has it happened to us? What is happening?
The living telegrams at that time. And pretty soon, you could feel a horror behind the door you was knocking. When you knock on the door, when the voice come out, yeah, who is it? Who is it? I say, I have a telegram. Well, slide it under the door, slide it on, or go away. Get away from me, get away from me.
The collapse of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929 was only the most visible sign of a massive economic crisis. A crisis that spread quickly from Wall Street to Main Street. Miriam John was living in California when the Great Depression arrived at her house.
I was 11 when the crash came. My father at that time, along with a few friends, owned a small grocery store. One day he came home and he laid $2 on the table in the kitchen. And he said, no more store. Everything is gone. And that was the end. For us, it was the end.
Every day produced more bankruptcies, more layoffs, more people with less money in their pockets. Even U.S. Steel, a symbol of American industrial might since the turn of the century, was brought to its knees. In 3 years, the entire full-time payroll was laid off. 225,000 workers.
The Depression hit this country all over. It hit the farm areas, it hit the cities. We were just there, out of work and out of food. And everybody was baffled. Nobody had ever had that experience before.
I had been saving for maybe 5-6 years a piggy bank, money in a piggy bank. Nickels, pennies, dimes the most. It turns out that I was the only one in the family that had any money. Because one day I came home and I grabbed hold of my piggy bank just to give it a shake, and there was nothing in it. My mother was looking at me and she said, your father borrowed the money. He has to go out to look for work and he needed money to go down. And he came home and I didn't say anything, but My face was swollen with tears. My eyes were blinking with tears. And my father took me in his arms and he said, "I'm sorry. I had to have money. But it's a loan. I'll pay it back to you." He never did. He never did.
My family had exhausted all its credits with local merchants. And on one occasion, my father came home and asked what was for dinner that night. And my mother said, "There's nothing." How could that be? How could there be nothing? It was one of the few times in my life that I was fearful for myself.
Fearful of losing what little they had left, people rushed to the banks to withdraw their savings. But the banks, too, were short of cash. 1 year after the crash, 800 of them had failed. 9 million savings accounts were wiped out.
There was a janitor called George Galley's who had $1,000 in the Bank of the United States. It had taken Galley's 40 years to save $1,000. After spending 2 nights and 2 days in the pouring rain outside this shuttered, locked bank, literally beating on the walls with his hands in frustration, he realized he was never going to see 10 cents of his money. And he went back to the basement where he lived, and he hanged himself in despair. That's what bank failures did. They crushed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of ordinary people like George Galley's.
With their savings gone and layoffs increasing, people were forced to sell their cars, their furniture, their wedding rings. Before long, half the country's home mortgages were in default. Families across America found themselves facing eviction.
I remember my brother and I and my mother just couldn't stand to see it happen. So we left my father there to face the auctioneers. When we came home that evening and we met my father, who told us, yes, the house was sold. It was gone. Everything that we had was no longer ours. The land was gone, the house was gone. And we had 30 days in which time to move out. And my mother sat on the side of the bed and cried. It was the first time I'd ever seen her cry. I'll never forget that moment. That's how our family was affected, and we were not unique.
You know what hurt me most about it was the look of pain on my mother's and father's faces. I couldn't bear to look at them, to look at their misery, to look at their disgrace.
They felt they had only themselves to blame. This was a different generation. This was a generation that had grown up with the old faith, the faith in self-reliance, that people had to stand on their own 2 feet. They didn't say the government has failed me. They said, I'm to blame. I failed in this American system of ours. It's my fault.
1 year after the crash, 4 million American families were without any means of support. Worse, they didn't know how to ask for help, and their government didn't know how to provide it.
In 1930, the American people had almost no sense of the national government. There was the post office. Occasionally you'd see a soldier on the street. The national government had very little direct impact on the lives of ordinary Americans.
There were no parachutes in those days. There was no Social Security, no unemployment insurance, no nothing.
Cheers.
Okay, that was some heavy duty stuff there. You know, when you talk about money and finances, it can be very personable, or personal. There we go, and a sensitive subject and all that stuff that goes with it. And so again, does anyone have any takeaways of you know, what you have just viewed? You know, I see in the chat, you know, how quickly you know, people lost things, and yes, it's amazing how fragile situations are, and how quickly. I mean, we're talking in terms of losing jobs. It's going to be a very quick snowball effect. I mean, if we think about currently, our unemployment, I believe, nationally is around 7 or 8%. It had got into close to double digits. But when we look at the Great Depression, I don't know if we can say highlight, probably more at its low point. We're talking almost 25% of the population is going to be affected by the Great Depression, affected by unemployment, I should say. And now that is not to say that everywhere in the United States you're going to see massive unemployment. There are going to be some regions where the impact is not going to be as far-reaching. We in Minnesota, though, it is going to impact us. We're an agrarian based state at the time, and we still really are agribusiness. And then we had some manufacturing, and we were definitely impacted by that. Losing savings, losing money, all that stuff. And I think that last point by what the one gentleman was saying is that there wasn't a lot of safety nets there. I mean, when you came in troubled times, you typically look towards your family and towards perhaps charity groups, but the government really wasn't one of those stopgap measures like we perhaps might see today. And so really, this is a time period that the United States is definitely in a crossroads, and we are going to examine, you know, as a people at this time, what is our role in these types of situations, and what could possibly be the role of government. Here again, like I said, it's a crossroads and a redefining moment here. It is a sad, and it's very unfortunate. And if you look at any of the literature of the time period, or any of the movies, or any of the artwork that's being created during this time period, it either focuses on the issues of the time, or tries to find ways to escape from this difficult time. I mean, one way to escape was go to the movies, and movies might have cost 5-10 cents. I mean, that's why we used to call them Nickelodeons. And I mean, you could literally sit in a movie theater for almost half of the day, and that was a great way to escape. I think of my grandparents at this time as well. I'm sorry, I'm digressing here, but my grandfather, he always had the Great Depression in the back of his mind, so he rarely threw things away. He always found ways to repurpose things, and that's a holdover from the Great Depression. He also said, "Hey, once you get a job, you know, no matter what type of job it is, how difficult it might be, just hang on to it, because you don't know if you're going to get another job." Again, that's another thought from holdover from the Great Depression. And So it definitely was very impactful. All right. With that, you are working on the causes of the Great Depression. So continue to do that. I think we're getting a good idea that the American economy was very fragile, and that the success, the roar aspect of the 1920s was really a veneer, that it was just right there on the surface. But if you peeled back that surface, you would see that there are some systemic problems. And are we going to try to fix those, or just kind of kick them down the road, kick the can down the road kind of mentality? And it seems like we're not paying attention to the signs that something big is going to happen. We can also put this in a global context as well. What's happening here in the United States is also happening in other countries as well. And how to get through it, and that's what Thursday, Friday, and next week is really looking at, is how we're going to get through this, and our leaders. All right. So if we think about the 1930s, we had 2 American presidents in the 1930s. Does anyone know who they are? Either put it in the chat or verbalize it.
Was it Hoover and Roosevelt?
Spot on. Hoover and Roosevelt. And Hoover is one termer, and he's at the beginning of the Great Depression, and we'll spotlight him tomorrow with Herbert Hoover. And then you got Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Franklin D. Roosevelt's going to be there for a little while. Remember, he's our president that gets elected 4 times. And so we didn't have term limits back then. He might be the reason why we have term limits. So those 2 individuals are our presidents, and we're going to find that their method to tackle the Great Depression is going to be different, because they sit on the different aisles here of the political spectrum and frame of thinking. Okay, but that's more tomorrow and Friday and the beginning of next week, how we're going to deal with this issue here. So with that, we should be working on it and get that taken care of today. It is worth some decent points here. So it's critical that you turn in that first assignment, because we want to have a good start to our new trimester. Okay, and so with that, you are free to go. I'm going to stay on here, so if people have questions, but you are free to go, and have a really great day.